guess we are all set to begin here. So I hope you all had a lovely long weekend. It's a little bit weird to have done Tuesday classes first and then come in today. I was all mixed up, but last week we finished up chapter 1, and predictably we're moving into chapter 2. So the title in the textbook is The Research Enterprise in Psychology, which is kind of a fancy way of them saying conducting research in psychology. Because we're basically just going to be talking about what kind of methods we use, things we need to keep in mind. We'll look a little bit at how we analyze, say, things like statistics, though you won't have to calculate any statistics. I put that disclaimer in there early on. There we go. All right. So in our chapter 1 discussion, we talked a little bit about that transition from rationalism to empiricism. And rationalism was the idea that knowledge can be obtained through reasoning. So that was when they would sit and think about thinking to try and understand how the mind worked. But we had argued that that isn't very scientific, that isn't very precise, and as they tried to move the field that would become psychology in a more scientific direction, they got away from that idea of rationalism. And instead, they adopted the idea of empiricism. So that's the concept that knowledge could be obtained through observation and experience. So that's where we bring in our scientific method. And so within the scientific enterprise, as they call it, or within psychology in general, or any science really, we have 3 major categories of goals. And we can break down most studies into one or more of these 3. So the first goal is measurement and description. So maybe you've noticed that there is some kind of phenomena going on in student populations. So you'd like to measure it and quantify it so that you can tell people about it. Maybe a lot of people wear a particular color on a certain day, and you want to see what proportion of the population wears that color. So that would be that first goal. Our second goal might be understanding and predicting based on things that we know about a population. So if we understand why people wear that color, then maybe we'll predict that since we've seen X portion of students in the past wearing that color on that particular day, in the future we would assume a similar proportion. So we use what we already know and use that to predict what we might see in the future. And then the third of our goals is application and control. So you take what you know and what you've been able to successfully predict in the past, and now you can start actually making use of that in the real world. So I can't really carry my previous example all the way through, but maybe we were talking about getting people to behave a certain way. Instead of wearing a particular color, maybe get them to do something. If you found things that influence them to do that desired behavior more, then maybe you can do stuff to get more people at the university doing that behavior. That would be an application and control where you're actually using what you've learned to cause a change. So research can be just one of these, or it can be all of these. It really depends on what it is you're trying to do and what you're working from. Because sometimes when you start, there's already a good understanding of a problem. Other times, not so much. And so for the next section, we're going to talk about the scientific method. Now, I find it interesting because I have 4 different psychology textbooks at home, and every single one of them has a different chart for the scientific method. Not because the scientific method varies dramatically between texts, but because they chop it up differently. So the order of events is pretty consistent, not just within psychology, but across most sciences, but different textbooks like to chop it in certain places. And so the numbers that are here, I just want you to know, are arbitrary. They're sort of how they've chosen to order them, but I won't do something like asking you what the 4th step of the scientific method is, because that will depend on what you've studied and what you're doing going forward. So just a little bit of a disclaimer there. And also, if you have learned about the scientific method, it might not line up exactly because everybody chops it differently. But the process that going from the beginning to the end will be more or less the same depending on what you're looking at. So we're going to focus on the process rather than the individual steps. So the first thing that you want to do when you're going to be conducting research is you want to formulate some kind of testable hypothesis. So you want to have an idea, something that you've maybe noticed in the real world, and you want to learn something about it. So we'll specify the difference between a hypothesis and a theory in a couple of slides, but for the purposes here, a hypothesis is something testable, where we say, based on the knowledge that we have already, if that knowledge is true, then we would predict to see this particular outcome. So that's what our hypothesis there is. So we want something where we can do a test that says, okay, if this particular emotion can be elicited by, say, advertisements, then putting up advertisements should lead to an increase in ratings of that emotion from students who see it. Cool, there's our testable hypothesis. Next, we want to select the research method and design, which kind of ties into our hypothesis a little bit, because in my example, we're talking about, okay, we'll show students an advertisement and measure their response to it. So we're going to have to think about what's the best way to do that? What's the best convention to do that? Do we do it in a controlled fashion, have them sit in a laboratory and show them that advertisement on a computer screen? Do we have them casually walk by it and then survey them afterwards? We have to pick. So that's where you decide on the specific method, the specific design you want to use. And that's based on a lot of stuff. Sometimes it's just on what you want to study. Or sometimes it's on what you have available to you. Maybe you don't have access to a ton of research participants that you can sit down in front of a computer and ask. So maybe you have to rely on stopping strangers on the street and asking them what they thought about a billboard. So lots of different limitations to keep in mind there. But once you've picked your hypothesis, you've chosen how you're going to specifically look at it, what your design is, then you can run it and collect your data. So maybe you wanted to go with a more controlled environment. You have a bunch of first-year undergrad students. They're going to sit in a room. You're going to show them this advertisement on the computer screen, and then you're going to measure their feelings using a predictable survey that seems to correlate very well with emotions. So we're going to do that. We're going to run as many students as we can. Maybe we have 100 students come through. We have our data of their emotions sort of before and after. Okay, so now we want to analyze the data and draw conclusions. Did we see a change in their emotional state between before and after? Or between students who saw the advertisement we're interested in and perhaps, say, a neutral image that's unrelated? We would include those sort of controls, which we'll discuss more throughout this lecture, in our design phase. But we're comparing and sort of drawing conclusions. Did we find a difference? Was there a change? Did the thing that we did affect their behavior? And then at the end, you can report the findings. Now, this is a little bit simplistic and leaves out the fact that in real research, it doesn't always go this cleanly. So it's very rare for things to work exactly as intended the first time through. Sometimes you have to then reevaluate and go back to your design phase and fix it. So even though it says here you're going to report your findings, you might circle back to, say, step 2 or step 3 and try again. Maybe you had a bad selection of participants. Maybe you had, maybe the study wasn't specific enough, or maybe it was getting confused with something else. Lots of things can go wrong, so you might go back and redo it. And sometimes, even if you get a bad, quote-unquote, result, then maybe that's something that's going to teach people things anyways. So not getting a significant difference isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's occasionally harder to get published, but that is its own problem. But having a null finding can actually be useful because you're showing people that I did the process and there wasn't an effect. So that's information too. So that's kind of how that works. So we're going to hop into a couple of terms, and some of these you might already know. Some of them we've kind of introduced as we've gone ahead, but I like to give some official definitions as we go through some of these. So the first is the concept of a variable. And that's sort of a generic catch-all term for any characteristic that can vary. So a variable is anything that you choose to measure or manipulate. So in our example, seeing the advertisement or seeing a neutral image would be a variable. That would be what were they exposed to. We can also have a variable of the emotion that they were feeling. So that could be another variable that we're measuring, and different participants can have different emotions. So variable is sort of our big catch-all term for those things. When we're talking about setting up our design, we've already said that we've done this, but we didn't name it at the time. And this is giving things operational definitions. So an operational definition is really important because it's going to define your variable not just as something generic like an emotion, but it's going to define it in terms of the specific procedures that are used to produce and measure it. So when we're talking about the emotion that we're feeling, I sort of slipped in the fact that we'd be measuring that emotion using an established scale, a survey that is known to correlate with emotions. So our operational definition, if we were writing this up, would be to tell people which specific survey we were using and what specific scores we were looking at within that survey. And so that's for survey type data. If you're doing something like measuring height, you would just say that you're measuring height in centimeters. People can figure out that you used a ruler. But with psychology, when we're measuring things that are a lot less easily visualizable, things like emotions or maybe things like brain activity or whatever, you have to tell people how you're getting that measure, where it's coming from. And that's why an operational definition is so essential. So you're giving a description in concrete, measurable terms so that people who are reading your research know exactly what you were measuring, but also those who want to replicate or repeat your research, other researchers could actually do your study again in a different population to see if they got the same results. So they know exactly what you did and how you did it because you define it. You'll also see the term participants or subjects. Some texts and some individuals will use them interchangeably. The convention that I've seen is that participants refers to humans and subjects can refer to sort of non-human animals. Though, again, sometimes they'll use them interchangeably. But these are just the organisms whose behavior that you're studying in your research. So when I was talking about using undergraduate students to expose them to that advertisement, those would be our human participants. If we were going to expose black-capped chickadees to different sounds, they would be research subjects. So it's just sort of the convention of how you refer to them. So for more terminology, we talk about statistics as the way that we analyze data and decide whether we're supporting our hypothesis or not. So if you've taken a stats course, you know that there's a lot more to statistics than that. But because this is an intro psych course, we're going to be keeping it fairly low level in terms of statistics. I also find that some people get intimidated by statistics. I was absolutely one of those. I didn't take a stats course until my 5th year of undergrad, which was really unfortunate because once I started doing research and realized how useful statistics are, I actually kind of like them now. So hopefully I can use that idea of what we use them for and the function of them to make them just a little bit more interesting, but I will also tell you I won't make you calculate anything. And then the last thing that I've kind of mentioned in that idea of reporting your findings, I didn't say where you're reporting them. So when you report findings, there are a couple of different things that you can do. One of them is that you can present your research at some kind of scientific meeting. So if you've ever heard someone talking about going to a conference, if they're maybe presenting a poster or giving a talk, that's presenting and sharing their findings at a scientific meeting. And so when you do that, as in academic, you would put that in your resume equivalent, your academic CV, and you would list it as a talk or a poster where you shared your research. So the more times you can share your research, it looks better for you. But these meetings aren't the only way that you can share that information. You can also publish your research in a scientific journal. And these journals are, I guess, another controversy in the field. There's all sorts of different things that people like and dislike about them, but it is still the standard to publish your work in a scientific journal, something that is peer-reviewed, meaning that other experts in that field will critically evaluate your paper before they accept it and give you any recommendations to improve it or make sure that it falls in line with what that journal wants. So some of the controversies with scientific journals is that you might have noticed if you were ever trying to look for a paper that they are usually held behind a paywall of some kind. And that's really unfortunate because as an author, we don't get involved in that at all. That all goes to the journal. The authors don't get anything from it. In fact, a lot of journals make us pay to publish in them, and then they still charge you for access, which is really fun. So while you're at university, it's really nice because you can use the university's library subscriptions to get access to a lot of stuff that you might lose once you're no longer a student. But yeah, I'm sure you can tell that there's a lot more to that, and I could ramble for quite a while, but that's scientific journals in a nutshell. So next we're going to start talking about actually collecting the data. How do we get the information? How do we measure the things that we want to measure in order to conduct the research that we're doing? So these are not an exhaustive list, but these are the ones that you tend to see most commonly in psychology. And so the first of these is direct observation. And that's just where you watch and record behavior as objectively and precisely as possible. Now, from the title alone, it's sort of implied that this has to be done in person, like you have to sit and watch something happening, but that's not always the case. Nowadays, it's a lot more common to use something like a video camera, or a microphone, or some other kind of sensor to get that data to collect it remotely, because then you don't have to be in the same room. And as we mentioned in our problems with studying psychology, humans are very reactive. If there's a person in the room, they're going to change their behavior. And most other animals are the same way, so if you can use a sort of hidden camera, then your behavior is going to be a little bit more natural. So direct observation, we're just going to watch what they're doing, we're going to write down what they're doing. We might also use a questionnaire. So a series of written questions designed to obtain information about people's attitudes, opinions, and different aspects of their behavior. Obviously, with a questionnaire, this really only applies to humans. So you can ask them questions, you can give them a survey, you can ask them on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you agree with each of these statements? Or you might ask them, how often do you engage in a particular behavior, and give them a bunch of options to pick from. So you can have questionnaires for all sorts of different things. They're very useful in psychology. Interviews are kind of like a face-to-face version of the questionnaire, but they usually tend to be a little bit more open-ended. So instead of choose from these 4 options, it would be you ask the question and then write down or record their response. But an interview tends to be, again, it implies in person, but nowadays it's a lot of, you can do it over the phone, or by Zoom, or Skype, or whatever. But you are engaging in a dialogue. We'll sometimes see psychological tests, and these are really interesting because they are specifically standardized measures that are trying to obtain a sample of the subject's behavior. So we're focusing on something where we know how people tend to score. We know what is a normal behavior to observe, and so we can conduct this test and compare a new group to what we know about our population as a whole. So a great example of this would be something like an IQ test. IQ tests are specifically designed so that the population has an average of 100. So we can use any of the multitude of standardized tests and know that an average person will score about 100, and we can see how new people score and compare them to that average. There are all sorts of problems with that, which we'll get into when we start talking about the difference between a population and a sample. But yeah, those are very commonly used. We also see things like physiological or neural recording, and this is when you're getting a direct measurement with some kind of instrument to monitor and record physiological processes right in the subject. So for studies of stress, they typically use something called skin conductance as a measure of stress. And basically what they do is they'll put 2 electrodes on your skin, and the electrodes will measure how much of a current passes between them. As you get more stressed, you tend to sweat, and even small levels of precipitation on your skin increase that conductance. So the machine can measure an increase in the current moving between those 2 electrodes, and they register it as you are more sweaty, therefore you are more stressed. So that would be a physiological recording where we get an indirect measure of stress by specifically measuring skin conductance. There's lots of different things we can use for that. We can do heart rate, or we can look at, say, the dilation of your eyes, or a whole host of different things. For neural recording, you can actually go in and record specific neurons or specific parts of the brain or the rest of the body in order to see which parts are active at any given time. So you can go as far as, say, single neuron recording, where again you have 2 electrodes, attach them along the length of a single cell, and those electrodes will register when the cell fires. So it'll show a small change in the charge, and that's that the cell is active. You can also go on a larger scale. You can use a brain scan of some kind in order to figure out what the brain is doing at a larger level. So lots of different ways that we can measure things directly within a subject. And then one that I find often gets left out is actually the examination of archival records. So this is when you analyze existing institutional records. In psychology, this is really important because sometimes we don't know that something's worth studying until much later. So a lot of very famous psychological studies have been conducted on sort of incidental pools of data. So things like, we'll talk about the Minnesota twin study. So in Minnesota, they kept very, very detailed records of the twins that were born within that state. And so they have records of sort of when they were born and blood type or whatever they got from their hospitals. They kept all of their medical records. And they would also keep record of anyone who was, say, adopted. And so you can start looking at things like, okay, well, twins have more common genetic material if they're the right kind of twins. So if we wanted to study something like the genetic component of particular behaviors, why don't we look at those medical records, follow up with those individuals, and see if any of them have, say, psychological disorders, and see if say a twin has a psychological disorder, maybe they've been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. Does their partner twin also have it? And is their partner more likely to have it than, say, some random unrelated stranger? And if we see a higher chance of both twins having it than anyone in the population, we can say that there's a genetic component, which we'll get into more in that part. I think it's the next chapter, but basically, they're using existing records that weren't specifically designed for psychological studies, but they've co-opted them to learn things. Another big one is, I think it's in Greenland, they keep a phenomenal record of mental health patients. And so you can do lots of genealogical studies to see who's related to whom and which families tend to be predisposed to different disorders based on existing data. So they don't have to go out and conduct new research, they don't have to do new surveys, they have existing sources that can give them lots of really good information. So it's something that usually doesn't occur to people, but is a very great source of information. All right, so next we're going to start talking about different types of research studies. And so typically when you think about research, most people will automatically start thinking about experiments. Science and experiments seems to be the fastest association that people have. But as you might have figured out by now, not all psychological research is experimental. We also see a lot of descriptive or correlational research. And sometimes you'll see the terms used fairly interchangeably. But specifically, when we're looking at descriptive methods, we're looking at things that are trying to capture or report or record or any other synonym you can think for the word describe a particular group. So usually you're trying to get some kind of measure, you're trying to do sort of that first goal of describing and measuring something to summarize what's happening. You don't necessarily need to explain it, you don't need to be able to predict it or anything like that, you just want to understand it. And so this is usually the first step in a lot of studies, and we'll look at things like naturalistic observation and participant observation and case studies and surveys, which are all examples of descriptive methods. Now, again, different texts will sometimes call this correlational research because you typically look at the data from these studies using correlations, where you can compare how two variables of interest will change over time together, but it's not always the case. So just drawing your attention to the fact that the terms are used interchangeably on occasion, but aren't exactly the same thing. All right, so we're going to talk about each of our 4 examples of descriptive methods one at a time. And so we're going to start with naturalistic observation. And this is when you basically just observe behavior without any kind of manipulation. So if you think of Jane Goodall observing apes in their natural habitat, that's a great example of naturalistic observation. So she went into that space and watched how they behaved in their natural environment. There were some extra things involved there, like giving them lots of time to get used to her presence, so that helps reduce reactivity and give us more confidence in the behavior that they're exhibiting, and things like that. But naturalistic observation is one of the best ways to get an idea of real-world behavior. And that's because you're observing their behavior in the real world. So it kind of makes sense. And the more you can do to make your presence less disruptive, the more you can be sure that that behavior is closer and closer to their natural behavior if unobserved. Some of our downsides here, the first being that you have no control over their behavior at all. So they're going to do whatever they're going to do, which could be good or bad. It can be problematic if you're trying to study some specific behavior. If you're looking to study very specific types of, trying to remember the word here, altruistic behavior, where you help someone else out, but it seems to be at a detriment to your own health. You can't set up a situation in which that would happen. You have to sort of wait for it to happen naturally, which kind of ties into the fact that naturalistic observation tends to be a very time-consuming process. You have to do a lot of watching, and we can now do most of it with video cameras, and then you can look back over large amounts of data, but even that takes a lot of time. We've done naturalistic observation studies with chickadees, but you have to either train a whole bunch of undergrads how to scan through video very quickly, or you have to somehow figure out how to program some kind of program that'll pick out movements that you're looking for, which in my experience has been less accurate than the undergrad army. Because we're not actually controlling or manipulating anything with naturalistic observation, we have this issue where we can't determine the cause of behavior. And this is going to be a running theme throughout our descriptive research, and that's because when you're not manipulating anything, when you're not manually changing something and conducting an experiment, then you can't be certain that you're getting the cause. So we can say from any of these descriptive methods that we found an association between two things. Maybe we found a correlation between two variables, but if we haven't specifically controlled for other stuff in the environment and done the manipulation ourselves, we can't say that this variable, changing this variable, causes a change in that variable. And that's one thing that you actually find with a lot of scientific media. If people don't have a background in science, they love to say that scientists have found that X causes Y. But then you read the study and it's a correlational experiment where they really didn't show that it's caused by that. We've just found that there's a relationship. But we'll go down that rabbit hole when we talk about correlations in more depth. So for right now, we're not saying that there's a direct causal relationship with any of these descriptive methods. One more thing, actually, before I move on with naturalistic observation, I mentioned that sometimes it's beneficial to use something like a hidden camera so that you're sure that you're getting natural behavior. There are ethical ramifications to that, and we'll talk about ethics at the end of this chapter, but if you're going to be using people in your experiment, you have to have what's called informed consent, basically where they know what's going on and they can tell you that it's okay to use their behavior, to use their data in your study. A hidden camera is the exact opposite of that. So they can't know that that's there. So if you're using a naturalistic observation setup, what you have to do is kind of get ethical approval to do it in reverse, which is you record the behavior first, and then you sit the participant down and say, this is what happened, can we still use your data? And if they say no for any reason, you have to delete what you have. So there's some things that you need to consider there. The next of these is participant observation, and this is actually very close to naturalistic observation, and this is when the researcher themselves sort of inserts themselves into their population of interest. So they themselves become a participant and observe whatever group they're trying to study from the inside. So this is really common with things like cults or even political groups or people from different countries or whatever. If you want to study a group and you want to study them very in depth, this is one way that you can do that. So it allows these researchers to gain insight from the participant's perspective by themselves becoming a participant in that group, which is pretty cool. But what we do have to keep in mind are some of the limitations here, which are that there are biases that can exist. So this researcher has come in and we've established that every individual has their own biases towards what they're viewing. Everything is perceived through the lens of their past experience. So these researchers have to keep in mind that what they're documenting, what they're interpreting, is being interpreted through their own perspective. So we are really subject to that interpretation. We have individual bias, and so it might not be as objective as some of the other forms of measurement. We also run into this issue where their observations may not be repeatable. The same idea as naturalistic observation. You can't control what they're doing or when they're doing it, so you're kind of stuck waiting for what you want to happen and knowing that it might not happen again. Next, we can talk about case studies. And this is when you have a very in-depth report or study of either a single person, a group of people, or a unique situation. Usually when you think of case studies, you think of a single individual who has some unique trait, who is studied very in-depth. But that's not the only case for case studies. If you have a group of individuals that experience something very strange that no one else has experienced, that entire group could be considered a case study. So maybe you found a culture that has minimal exposure to other cultures. So you could have a case study looking at just the individuals in that one culture. We also have that strange situation where people who have encountered odd situations, you could look at things like, I always have to write down examples because I blank out on this one. Maybe you have a group of people and you're looking at individuals who are in head-on car collisions and survived. So it's a very specific situation and you want to study exactly those people or something like that. So these aren't just a single person, though that's usually what we see, but they allow us to collect a lot of detail, like exorbitant amounts of detail, of very specific scenarios. So when we pick a single person, it's usually someone who has suffered some kind of impairment. With psychology, it's a lot of there's been something gone wrong with their brain. Maybe we'll look at HM in just a moment, where part of his brain was removed to try and help reduce the epileptic seizures that he was suffering. And that process did actually stop the seizures. I have an image here where you can see a normal brain where it has all of that material in the center, but in HM, his hippocampus was removed, which stopped the seizure activity, but led to the inability to form new memories. So this is something that doesn't happen to most people, but it gave psychologists a very unique way to be able to observe what was going on and what might change when that structure is removed. And so we kind of mentioned actually the one who was doing that research. I just remembered her name and then I forgot it. It was one of the Canadian researchers. I can see the slide. It was the first one we talked about. She worked with HM. This is why I don't test on names. But she studied HM and looked at how having that part of his brain removed changed his ability to form memories. Specifically, he couldn't form new long-term memories, but he could still form, procedural memory. So he could learn to do new tasks, but he didn't remember actually doing those tasks. So that gives us the opportunity to test that one specific situation, that one individual in this case, and get lots and lots of detail. They can do lots of tests and surveys and psychological recordings and things like that, but it's not an experiment because they don't manipulate these individuals to be the way that they are intentionally to study their psychological outcomes. They find people who have had something happen and they're sort of making the best of a strange situation where they can see what happens when this has already occurred. So we'll see a lot of individuals who have had different kinds of brain injury that's led to weird occurrences or abilities or loss of ability, and we'll talk about those as we get into mostly the chapter on memory, because that's where it's most important. Because we're looking at a situation where our study is done on either one individual or one group, we really have a sample size of one, which isn't great statistically speaking. Usually if you want to draw any kind of conclusions, you want to look at as many cases as possible. But a case study by definition only gives you one measurement. So it can be very difficult to try and draw some kind of causal relationship. So yes, HM lost his long-term memory after suffering that specific damage to his brain, but what if there was something else going on? Or what if it wasn't the removal of the whole hippocampus, but only one part of it? Or what if the removal of the hippocampus affected something else? We have all of these what-ifs to consider, so we can't draw direct causal conclusions without getting more information. So that's our, again, repeating with no causality from descriptive research. And then our last kind of descriptive research is a survey. So these are the questionnaires, interviews, those sorts of things. A lot of surveys, especially within psychology, are questions that have been designed and tested to extract very specific information from a group of people. And these are really common because with a lot of psychological questions, people tend to care about similar things. There's a lot of people who do research on personality. There's a lot of people who do research on intelligence, and therefore would want IQ tests. There's tests of motor skills, of logic skills, of reasoning, of all different things. Basically, if you can think of a category that a psychologist might be curious in, there exists numerous surveys that have been designed for that purpose. And this is really useful because they're fairly easy to administer. If you have a pre-existing survey, something that's already been tested and shown to be fairly effective, then you don't have to make your own. You don't have to start from scratch. So all you do is take that existing, widely accepted survey and deliver it to the group that you're interested in. So maybe you want to connect personality traits and scores in different types of classes. You want to see what students' grades were. So you get a group of participants, you give them the test, you get a copy of their CV, and you compare the two. So this is how useful surveys can be. It's a really effective approach to gather lots of information, especially nowadays where you can do this on a computer. Instead of having to have someone sit down and take a paper test, you can send them a link to a website, and they can click through and do the whole survey. And you can have them do fairly long surveys in fairly short amounts of time just by having the questions pop up one after the other. So you can get lots of different information. You can look at multiple things all at once. Maybe you want to get personality data and logical reasoning skills, and something else. So ask all the questions. So lots and lots of data there. But again, we have to keep in mind that there's the possibility for bias from either the researchers or the participants. And this is an interesting one because as researchers, if we're asking someone in person, we can influence the way that they answer. So you can ask a question in a leading way. So you could say, oh, you do this thing, right? And they want to agree, which might not be what they actually do, but your presence makes them want to agree with you. So the participants can be biased, the researchers can do the biasing, and it can cause some problems. So we have to be careful with those survey questions to design them in a way to minimize that. But we can talk more about that later. And I think we're actually pretty good on time here, so the next couple of slides are all about experimental research, and that's a whole thing. So we'll start there next class, so on Friday, and I'll let you guys go just a little bit early today.